Just after midnight on June 20th, 1965, four young men climbed a chain-link fence posted with warning signs in a stretch of Nevada desert called Ash Meadows. Paul Giancontieri was 19 years old, a cafeteria worker at the nearby Nevada test site. His brother-in-law, David Rose, was 20, a parking attendant at a Las Vegas casino. They had brought scuba gear, dive lights, and two friends, brothers named Bill and Jack Alter. One of the Alters decided the fence, and what lay past it, was not worth the risk, and stayed above ground. The other three did not turn back. What they climbed down to was a gap in solid rock, roughly 8 feet wide and 60 feet long, opening onto a pool of startlingly warm water 30 feet below the desert floor. The water was 93 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature of a bath, in a place where the surrounding ground can reach 120 in July. Giancontieri and Rose suited up and dropped beneath the surface. Bill Alter waited above. Neither man came back up. Waiting above ground that night were two women who would spend the coming hours not knowing whether they were widows. Paula Rose, 20 years old and married to David for barely 2 months, stood at the fence with Giancontieri's mother while search crews assembled. Neither man came home to them. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The place they had entered is called Devil's Hole, and 60 years later, divers still have not found its bottom. It sits on a detached 40-acre parcel of Death Valley National Park, physically separated from the rest of the park by more than 20 miles of open desert. President Harry Truman set the land aside by proclamation in 1952, not for scenery, but for what was living inside the water, a fish found nowhere else on Earth, in a cave system whose true depth nobody could state with confidence. That combination, an isolated aquifer opening in the middle of a desert and a species trapped inside it, is what has drawn geologists, biologists, federal agents, cave divers, and at least one criminal cult leader to a hole in the ground the size of a 2-car garage. The search for Giancontieri and Rose began within hours. 45 park rangers and volunteer divers converged on the site, splitting into teams and descending in relays to depths of over 300 feet, hunting through total darkness in passages barely wide enough for a man in tanks to pass through. One of the volunteer divers was a Californian named Jim Houts, who had logged some 300 previous dives at Devil's Hole over the preceding years, and knew its layout better than almost anyone alive. During the second day of the search, Houts and a dive partner lowered a weighted line into the deepest accessible shaft and let it run out. It reached 932 feet before the line went slack, and it still had not touched anything. The search was called off after 36 hours. The only physical trace the two young men left behind was a mask, a snorkel, and a flashlight, found tied to a rock ledge roughly 100 feet down, apparently left as a marker to guide their way back out. It did not work. Their bodies were never recovered. What makes Devil's Hole worth returning to 60 years later is not the tragedy alone, it is what the tragedy exposed, a fracture in the earth that behaves less like a cave and more like a window into something enormous, and almost nothing about it has ever been fully mapped, measured, or explained. Start with the geology, because the geology is the part nobody disputes. Devil's Hole is a fault-line fissure in ancient carbonate rock, limestone and dolomite, laid down as marine sediment hundreds of millions of years ago, later fractured and hollowed out by groundwater, working through cracks over an immense stretch of time. Calcite deposits on its walls have been dated by researchers to roughly 60,000 years, which tells you how long the cavity itself has existed in something close to its current shape. It is not an isolated pocket of water. It is the visible mouth of a vast regional aquifer that stretches for hundreds of square miles beneath the Amargosa Desert, an aquifer that also happens to run beneath the Nevada test site where the United States detonated dozens of underground nuclear devices during the Cold War. The water inside Devil's Hole fell as snow on the surrounding mountains during the last ice age, filtered down through porous rock for thousands of years, and is only now surfacing, which means a person looking into that pool is looking at water older than agriculture. That stillness is exactly what made Devil's Hole valuable to science, in a way that has nothing to do with the fish at all. In 1992, a United States Geological Survey researcher named Isaac Winograd published a paper in the journal Science built on a thin column of mineral deposit, a vein of calcite that had grown, layer upon layer, along the cave wall over the course of 500,000 years, as groundwater seeped through the fracture and left behind traces of calcium carbonate, the way stalactites form in any limestone cave. Winograd and his colleagues extracted a core of that calcite, 36 centimeters long, and used it to reconstruct 500,000 years of Earth's climate history through variations in oxygen isotopes trapped inside it, an uninterrupted record longer and in some ways more precisely dated than anything pulled from ocean sediment or polar ice at the time. What the record showed did not simply confirm the existing model, it challenged it. The dominant explanation for the timing of ice ages, known as Milankovitch theory, holds that the advance and retreat of continental ice sheets is paced by slow, predictable wobbles in Earth's orbit and tilt. The Devil's Hole calcite indicated that the most recent major warming, the end of the second-to-last ice age, had begun roughly 17,000 years earlier than the orbital theory predicted it should have. Other climate scientists, including Nicholas Shackleton and John Imbrie, published rebuttals questioning the dating methods and the record's relevance to global rather than regional climate. Winograd and his co-authors published responses defending the chronology. The disagreement ran through the scientific literature for the better part of a decade, and elements of it remain unresolved today, with later studies from other cave sites in the region reaching different conclusions about how strongly Devil's Hole's climate signal actually challenges orbital forcing. It does not in dispute is the record itself, still sitting in the wall of the cavern, a 500,000-year archive of the planet's climate, preserved by the same fracture nobody has ever fully explored the bottom of. The opening itself, the part visible from the surface, is small enough to seem almost unremarkable, a gash in the rock you could walk past without noticing if it weren't fenced. Below the surface, it opens dramatically. Early divers from the Southwestern Speleological Society, who first explored the system in February 1961, described its shape as resembling a boot, with the pool descending at a steep angle into a chamber later divers named Brown's Room, a 50-foot-tall cavern accessible only through the original narrow entrance. Deeper still, the passage bends into what divers came to call the Infinity Room, because every attempt to find its end has failed. In 1991, a team from the United States Geological Survey conducted the most thorough survey the site has ever received. Divers Alan Riggs and Paul DeLoach, working alongside a diving pioneer named Sheck Exley, descended to 436 feet, at the extreme edge of what breathing compressed air at that depth allows a human body to survive. From there, they reported being able to see the passage continuing to curve downward for what they estimated was another 150 feet, roughly to the 500-foot mark, before it vanished from the range of their lights. They went no further. To this day, no diver has confirmed a floor. Estimates for the true depth of Devil's Hole range from 500 feet to as much as 900, based on nothing more solid than a weighted line dropped by a rescue diver in 1965 that never found resistance. The reason nobody has gone back to settle the question is simple. Devil's Hole holds one of the most fragile and heavily protected wild populations of any vertebrate on the planet, and it does not tolerate visitors well. The fish is called the Devil's Hole pupfish, Cyprinodon diabolis, a species between 1 and 1.5 inches long, iridescent blue in males and a duller olive green in females, found in this single pool and nowhere else on the surface of the Earth. It survives on a shallow limestone shelf near the mouth of the cave, roughly 215 square feet in total, about the footprint of a small living room, where sunlight reaches far enough down to support the algae mat it feeds on. Almost the entire wild population, and almost all of its spawning, happens within that narrow patch of rock. Everything about its existence defies ordinary biological expectation. It lives in water that would kill most freshwater species outright, 93 degrees, and desperately low in dissolved oxygen, close enough to the fish's own physiological limits that biologists describe the population as living permanently near the edge of what its body can tolerate. It has persisted for generations at a population size that conservation biologists generally consider a death sentence, a group small enough that inbreeding alone should have erased it decades ago. Recent genomic work has confirmed exactly that cost is being paid, finding some of the lowest genetic diversity ever recorded in a wild vertebrate population and a measurable rate of embryos that die before they can hatch. The accumulated toll of thousands of generations spent in a gene pool with nowhere to draw new blood from. And for most of the 20th century, scientists assumed the species had been trapped there since the end of the last ice age, 10 to 20,000 years, isolated as the wetter Pleistocene landscape of interconnected lakes and rivers, dried into the desert we see today. Then the genetics came back, and they told a stranger story. In 2016, a research team led by Christopher Martin, a biologist then at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, published a study in the Proceedings of the Royal Society sequencing over 13,000 genetic markers from the Devil's Hole pupfish and its closest surviving relatives. What they found upended the assumption that had stood for half a century. Rather than diverging tens of thousands of years ago during the last ice age, the genetic data suggested the population currently living in Devil's Hole may have colonized the pool somewhere between 105 and 830 years ago. Some estimates from the underlying data pushed the figure as low as a few generations before the fish was first formally documented by scientists in 1893. The cave itself, remember, is 60,000 years old. The fish living in it, according to this analysis, might be barely older than the founding of the United States. That finding did not settle quietly into the literature. Other researchers pushed back, arguing that the mutation rates used to calibrate the timeline were unreliable, and proposing alternative models that placed the population's isolation tens of thousands of years earlier, closer to the traditional estimate. The dispute, conducted through peer-reviewed rebuttals rather than press releases, remains open. Published estimates for the age of this single population span from roughly 200 years to 500,000, a gap wide enough to swallow the entire span of recorded human history twice over. What both camps of researchers agree on is stranger than either individual estimate. Whatever the true timeline turns out to be, the Devil's Hole pupfish evolved distinctive physical traits, including the loss of pelvic fins entirely, on a timescale that should not have been long enough for that kind of change to fix itself into a population this genetically starved. It is a species that, by the numbers, should not exist in the form it exists in. It does anyway. Watching over that fish became, unexpectedly, a matter for the highest court in the country. By the late 1960s, a ranching family named Capert had begun pumping groundwater from wells on a nearby property for alfalfa irrigation, wells that were, geologically speaking, drawing from the same connected aquifer that feeds Devil's Hole. The water level in the pool began dropping. Between 1969 and 1972, the surface fell nearly 4 feet, and as it fell, it exposed more and more of the shallow rock shelf the pupfish depend on to spawn, threatening to starve the species out of existence through simple thirst. The federal government sued to stop the pumping. The case, Capert versus United States, reached the Supreme Court, and in 1976, the court ruled unanimously that when Truman set the land aside in 1952, he had implicitly reserved enough groundwater to keep the pool at a level sufficient to sustain the fish, a doctrine that reshaped water law across the American West. It remains one of the only instances in American legal history where the survival of an inch-long fish in a hole in the desert produced a binding precedent on federal water rights. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Since 1972, biologists from the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, and the Nevada Department of Wildlife have counted the population nearly every spring and fall without interruption, one of the longest continuous wild population studies of any vertebrate species on the planet. The numbers have been counted directly, some divers descending into the cavern itself, while others count from the surface shelf, comparing tallies to cross-check accuracy. The population has swung wildly across that half-century of record-keeping, from a high near 550 fish down to a low of 35 individuals counted in the fall of 2013, a number small enough that extinction seemed less like a risk than an inevitability. It did not happen. The population climbed back into the hundreds over the following decade, reaching 263 fish in 2022, the highest count in 19 years. The scare in 2013 was serious enough that the Fish and Wildlife Service stopped relying on hope alone. In 2013, using a grant from the Southern Nevada Public Land Management Act, the agency completed a facility a short drive from Devil's Hole itself, built around a 100,000-gallon tank, engineered to physically replicate the uppermost 22 feet of the actual cavern, matching its water chemistry, its temperature, and a hand-built copy of the shallow spawning shelf down to its dimensions. Staff travel to Devil's Hole roughly once a month to collect eggs, algae, and the tiny invertebrates the pupfish feed on, ferrying pieces of the real ecosystem back to the replica to keep a captive backup population alive in case the original is ever lost. Researchers from the Desert Research Institute later compared the microbial life in the two tanks side by side and found that even with every visible variable controlled for, the replica's water chemistry still did not fully match the original, a reminder that reproducing 60,000 years of geology is harder than reproducing a fish tank. The most recent test of that safety net came in the spring of 2025, when a routine dive count turned up roughly 20 pupfish, among the lowest totals ever recorded, a decline biologists attributed in part to earthquake activity disrupting the shelf and reducing the algae the fish depend on. Within a year, the count had nearly quadrupled to 77 fish, evidence, biologists noted, that the population was spawning again inside Devil's Hole itself. Several hundred more remained safely housed in the replica tank the entire time. The population has fluctuated for over half a century now, monitored twice a year by teams who still cannot fully explain why a species this constrained keeps finding a way to persist. The site has not always been treated with the caution that record deserves. In 1969, according to accounts collected by researchers and later cult investigators, Charles Manson visited the Ash Meadows region during the period he was preparing his followers for what he called helter-skelter, and reportedly viewed Devil's Hole as a possible entrance to a subterranean refuge where his family could wait out an apocalypse he believed was coming. Manson was arrested at a nearby ranch later that year before any such plan could be tested. More recently, in October 2016, 3 men climbed the protective fence at night, and one of them, intoxicated, jumped into the pool itself, an act captured on the refuge's surveillance system and later prosecuted federally, since the pupfish habitat is protected under the Endangered Species Act and unauthorized entry into the water constitutes a federal crime. The man who jumped in was ordered to pay over $46,000 in restitution and sentenced to a term of probation, a reminder that the barrier around Devil's Hole is not symbolic. Investigators later determined the group had knocked over a security camera and left beer cans and vomit near the shelf where the entire wild population of an endangered species feeds and breeds. A single reckless night close enough to a real ecological catastrophe that federal prosecutors treated it as one. None of this, the geology, the genetics, the court case, the fence, exists in isolation. Devil's Hole belongs to a small category of places on Earth where a narrow opening at the surface conceals something disproportionately large and largely unmapped underneath. And looking at how those other sites have played out tells you something about what Devil's Hole itself may still be hiding. Roughly 250 miles south of Flagstaff, Arizona, there is another such opening called Montezuma Well, a limestone sinkhole formed the same way, through the collapse of an underground cavern once dissolved out of the bedrock by groundwater. Unlike Devil's Hole, its collapse breached all the way to daylight, forming a nearly circular pool roughly 360 feet across. The Sinagua people, ancestors of several present-day tribes in the region, farmed its outflow using hand-dug irrigation canals that remain visible along the canyon walls today, some of them still carrying water more than 1,000 years after they were cut. The water inside Montezuma Well carries an unusually high concentration of dissolved carbon dioxide and arsenic, high enough that no fish species has ever been able to survive there, not one, in a body of water surrounded on all sides by streams and rivers full of them. In their place, the pool hosts several species found nowhere else in the world: a leech, a species of water scorpion, and a tiny amphipod, all endemic, all isolated by the same chemistry that keeps everything else out. The National Park Service, which now administers the site, still lists the full extent of the underwater vent system feeding the well as unmapped, a detail that draws far less attention than it would if the well sat in the Nevada desert instead of a shaded canyon a short drive from a highway. Like Devil's Hole, its true depth was disputed for decades. Diving surveys eventually confirmed a maximum of around 55 feet, considerably shallower than its Nevada counterpart, and confirmed that the pool is fed not by a single spring, but by a network of underwater vents pushing out roughly 1.5 million gallons of geothermally warmed water every day, water that never gets more than a few degrees colder even in winter. The pattern holds regardless of the depth, a hole that looks small from the rim, hiding an ecosystem that formed nowhere else on the planet, sustained by water chemistry nobody fully engineered and nobody can fully explain. The second comparison is harder to look at directly because it involves the same man who helped survey Devil's Hole in 1991. Sheck Exley was not a professional adventurer by trade. He taught mathematics at a high school in Live Oak, Florida, and dove caves on his own time, becoming over 3 decades one of the most respected cave divers who ever lived, the first chairman of the cave diving section of the National Speleological Society and the author of the field's standard safety text. In the years after his work at Devil's Hole, Exley turned his attention to a sinkhole in the Mexican state of Tamaulipas called Zacaton, a water-filled shaft that early depth soundings suggested might be the deepest of its kind anywhere on Earth. On April 6, 1994, Exley and a diving partner named Jim Bowden descended into Zacaton together, attempting to become the first humans to reach its floor. Bowden made it to 925 feet before his air supply forced him to turn back, setting a men's depth record in the process. Exley did not return. His body was recovered later at a depth of roughly 880 feet, most likely killed by high-pressure nervous syndrome, a poorly understood breakdown of the central nervous system that can strike divers breathing gas under extreme pressure, a condition he had briefly and survivably experienced the year before during a training dive in South Africa. Bowden spent more than 9 hours decompressing on his way back to the surface, most of it not knowing whether his friend was still somewhere in the water beneath him. Zacaton's actual floor was not confirmed by a human being at all. Divers had gone as deep as any person reasonably could, and still found nothing but more water underneath them. It took until 2007, when a NASA-funded autonomous robot named DepthX, built as a test platform for future missions to search for microbial life beneath the ice shell of Jupiter's moon Europa, was lowered into the shaft on a cable and used sonar to map the chamber as it descended, finally confirming a true bottom at 1,098 feet. Nearly twice the depth Exley had reached before he died, trying to get there in a body instead of a machine. 2 sinkholes, 1 man, 3 years apart. In both cases, the deepest human beings could safely go was not the bottom. In one case, the actual floor was only found decades later, and only by a machine built for another planet entirely. There is one more piece of the Devil's Hole record worth sitting with, because it has nothing to do with depth or fish at all, and it is arguably the strangest confirmed fact about the place. Devil's Hole reacts to earthquakes on the other side of the planet. Large seismic events in Japan, Indonesia, Chile, and Mexico, thousands of miles away, have repeatedly caused the water inside the cavern to slosh violently against its limestone walls, a phenomenon called a seismic seiche, in which the long, slow surface waves generated by a distant quake happen to match the natural resonant frequency of the water trapped in that specific chamber. Following the 2012 earthquake off the coast of Mexico, park staff observed waves surging as high as 2 meters up the cave walls, roughly 6.5 feet, inside a pool that under normal conditions sits almost perfectly still. A magnitude 8.6 earthquake off Alaska in 2018 produced measurable sloshing as well, prompting the park's aquatic ecologist, Kevin Wilson, to note publicly that the response depends less on the sheer size of a quake than on its depth, its distance, and some quality of the fault rupture that researchers still cannot fully predict in advance. Geologists studying the phenomenon have described Devil's Hole as functioning like an extraordinarily sensitive natural seismograph, one shaped by forces underground that nobody designed and that only reveal themselves when the rest of the planet, thousands of miles away, happens to shake. A federal team analyzing 24 years of continuous water level data found that Devil's Hole responds only above a certain threshold of seismic energy, and that the size of its reaction does not track cleanly with either the magnitude of a quake or its distance, meaning something about the specific geometry of the fracture, its depth, its shape, the arrangement of chambers still unmapped below 436 feet, determines which tremors on the far side of the Earth it chooses to notice and which it ignores entirely. This is not an abstract curiosity for the fish living on the shelf a few feet below the surface. When researchers pointed to earthquake activity as a factor in the drop to roughly 20 pupfish counted in the spring of 2025, they were describing a direct physical chain of cause and effect, shaking transmitted through hundreds or thousands of miles of solid rock, arriving at a fracture in the Nevada desert, and disturbing the shallow algae mat a fragile, isolated species depends on to eat. A quake nobody in Nevada felt at all can still reach down through the ground and rearrange the only home an entire species has. Put all of it together, and what you have is not a mystery that has been solved and is waiting to be revealed. It is a mystery that has been measured, litigated, surveyed, and studied continuously for over 60 years by people with federal funding, peer review, and some of the best cave diving expertise in the world, and it is still not resolved. Nobody has confirmed how deep the cavern actually goes below the 500-foot mark Riggs, Deloach, and Exley reached in 1991. Nobody has fully settled whether the fish living inside it arrived a few hundred years ago or tens of thousands. Nobody can predict with certainty which earthquake, on which continent, will make the water climb the walls next. The uncertainty here is not the product of records withheld or evidence suppressed. It is the product of a place that is, by any honest measure, still too dangerous and too fragile to fully explore, protected as much by its own physics as by the fence and the felony statute surrounding it. What we do know is enough to make the place worth returning to on its own terms. The water inside Devil's Hole fell as snow before the first cities existed. The rock around it has held its shape since long before the first humans crossed into the Americas at all. A 500,000-year climate record sits preserved in its walls, still generating disagreement among scientists 30 years after it was first read. A fish smaller than a human thumb survives inside it, against odds that conservation biology says it should not be able to survive, on a timeline researchers still cannot agree on to within several 100,000 years. And somewhere below 436 feet, in the dark Exley, Riggs, and Deloach described curving away beneath their lights in 1991, the passage is still there, still unexplored, still exactly as unmapped now as it was on the night 2 young men climbed a fence in 1965 and never came back up. No agency has withheld that information. No institution has buried it. It simply has not been reachable by anyone in 60 years of trying. Whatever is down there has outlasted every attempt to reach it. So far, it still has. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, Check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.